The October wind was snapping the sheets on the clothesline, and my mother wouldn't meet my eyes as she pinned my white cape dress. I watched her hands, practiced hands that had kneaded bread dough before dawn since she was 12, that had guided 6 babies into the world with a midwife in our back bedroom, that now moved very carefully around the edges of this moment, like she was afraid of what was inside it. I was getting married in 4 days, and my mother had nothing to say to me. Not nothing, exactly. She had 7 words. I know because I counted them later, the way you count things when you're trying to understand how a number that small was supposed to carry the weight of a life. It's like planting seed in a garden. That was it. 7 words, and then she handed me a damp sheet to hang, and we didn't speak about it again. If you've ever been handed a map with most of the roads missing and been told to find your own way home, stay with me, because I want to talk about what happens to 2 people when the most important room in their marriage is built entirely out of silence. I'm Hannah. This is Beyond the Bonnet. I grew up Old Order Amish, and these are the stories we were never permitted to tell. If this matters to you, hit subscribe and leave me a comment below. I want to know, what's the most important thing about your own life that nobody ever sat down and explained to you? I read everyone. My mother wasn't a cold woman. I want to be careful about that because it would be easier to make her into a villain and call it a day. She wasn't. She was warm and capable, and she showed love by showing up. There with food, there with her hands, there in the middle of the night when a child was sick. Love, in our world, was a verb. It was action, not conversation. But there was a whole category of conversation that simply didn't exist. The Ordnung didn't have a rule written down anywhere that said, you may not explain a woman's body to your daughter before her wedding. It didn't need to. The silence was so total, so old, it had the weight of scripture. To speak plainly about bodies was to invite hogmut, pride, worldliness, the inching open of a door that was supposed to stay shut. Modesty wasn't just about the length of your hem. It was about the borders of what could be said out loud. So the knowledge passed sideways in the narrow spaces between women. A cousin at the water pump, a sister behind the clothesline, my mother at the drying rack with 7 words and her eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder. What she gave me wasn't instruction. It was a posture. Be willing. Be patient. Let it happen to you. The seed and garden metaphor was the closest our community came to biology. I've since heard versions of it from women across 3 counties. The same words, almost identical, handed down through generations like a quilt pattern nobody had examined too closely. It sounded gentle, pastoral. It had the soft authority of something that must be true because everyone had always said it. What it didn't have was any of the actual information I needed. My husband came to our wedding night knowing less than I did. I think about that a lot even now, the way the burden of ignorance fell unevenly. Women got metaphors, men got nothing at all. A young Amish man was not supposed to have curiosity about a woman's body before marriage. Curiosity itself was suspect. So he arrived in that room the same way I did, with a role to fill and no idea how to fill it without causing harm. We were 20 and 19. We'd spoken to each other maybe 50 times in our lives. Always in a group, always in daylight, always within earshot of someone's mother. I knew the shape of his hands and that he was gentle with horses and that he could fix almost anything made of wood. I didn't know him, and he didn't know me in the way that matters when 2 people are suddenly alone in the dark for the first time. What happened in marriages like ours wasn't violence. It was confusion. Two people fumbling through something they hadn't been permitted to study, each one trying to do it right, neither one with any definition of what right even was. The pain I felt that night, I understood as the price of being a wife. Nobody had told me otherwise. My mother's "be patient" had prepared me to endure, not to expect anything different, so I endured. And I got very good at leaving. Not leaving the room, I mean leaving myself. There's a word for it that I didn't learn until I was sitting across from a therapist in a small office in Ohio. A grown woman finally looking at a diagram of her own anatomy for the first time. She called it dissociation. I called it counting ceiling boards. In our first bedroom, there were 14 full knots in the wood above the bed, and one that was split almost in half. I knew them the way I knew the Lord's Prayer, by rote, in order, without thinking. I would start planning the next day's baking somewhere around the 5th knot. By the 14th, I was already gone. I thought this was just what marriage was. The older women at church had a way of nodding at a new bride the morning after her wedding, a specific nod, knowing and quiet like yes. We know, we've all been there. I read that nod as confirmation. This is normal. This is how it goes. Keep going. It never occurred to me that the nod might mean something different, that it might mean we were never told either and nobody told us to expect anything better. So we learned to count ceiling boards too, and we handed that silence down to you, and we're sorry, but we don't have the words. The therapist's name was Carol. She had a poster on the wall that I kept looking at sideways while I tried to remember how to breathe normally. She used words I had genuinely never heard applied to myself: consent, autonomy, readiness. She explained that my body had not been broken or punished or wrong. It had been responding, exactly as bodies do, to conditions that didn't feel safe. The pain had not been the price of being a wife. It had been information. Information I had never been given permission to act on. I cried for a long time in that office, not because what she said was terrible, because it was so plain, so ordinary, a diagram, some words, things that took maybe 15 minutes to explain. Things that, had someone sat with me before my wedding and said them plainly, might have changed the entire shape of those early years. My mother wasn't cruel. She gave me what she had, which was what her mother had given her. The silence wasn't invented to hurt me. It was just very, very old, and it had been kept so long it had started to look like wisdom. I don't tell this story to make you pity me. I had a life inside that silence that had real beauty in it. The sound of a wood fire at 5 a.m, bread rising under a cloth, neighbors arriving with food before you even knew you needed it. That part was real too. But beauty and harm can share a house. You can belong somewhere completely and still lose yourself inside it. The harm doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just the thing that was never said. A conversation that never happened, a diagram that stayed in a book you weren't allowed to open, 7 words, where there should have been an hour. If someone handed you silence instead of language for your own body, if you came to your own life without a map and had to draw one yourself in the dark from scratch, I want you to know something. You weren't broken. You were just never told. And those are not the same thing. Leave me a comment. Tell me one thing about your own life that no one ever explained. I want to know.
And if you want more of these stories from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Beyond the Bonnet.